Hey there, Twisters, and welcome, hockey fans. Today's video is all about the biggest rivalries in the NHL, both historic and current. So we're going to touch on all 32 teams in this video. One of the reasons why I love the NHL so much is because of rivalries, because of the fights that break out, because of the intensity, especially during the playoffs, the feuds between players. It's just one of the most unique and wonderful things about being a hockey fan, being a fan of the NHL. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What is your favorite moment from your favorite team's biggest rivalry, and shout out other ideas that you have for content like this. We produce content on the NHL season by season, so stick around if you're new here. We'd love to have you here, no matter who you cheer for. All right, guys, let's get into it. All right, so we're going to do this by division. We'll start with the Metropolitan Division, and my first team is the New York Islanders. Their biggest historic and current rival, I would say, is the New York Rangers. Of course, you have other New York sports rivalries like the Knicks and the Nets for the NBA, and the Yankees and Mets for MLB. But this rivalry really blossomed in 1979 when Dennis Potvin broke Ulf Nilsson's ankle unintentionally, sparking the whole "Potvin sucks" chant. That's still heard at Madison Square Garden every now and then. The Islanders won 4 straight Stanley Cups in the 1980s and defeated the Rangers in 3 consecutive runs. Islanders fans would also chant 1940 to remind the Rangers of the last time they won the Stanley Cup, which they would later win in '94. My honorable mention, some of the Islanders' best moments have come in their 6th playoff series versus the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now let's talk about the Rangers. Their biggest historic rivalry is an original 6 rivalry with the Boston Bruins. They've clashed over 666 times in the regular season and 10 times in the playoffs in a span of nearly 100 years. The Bruins have won 7 of the 10 series, including the 1972 Stanley Cup Final. You had Hall of Famers like Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito for the Bruins against Jean Martel and Raj Gilbert for the New York Rangers. Then in '79, you had the infamous fan brawl when Terry O'Reilly, Mike Milbury, and others went into the stands to confront a Rangers fan who had assaulted Stan Jonathan. Milbury actually hit the fan with his shoe and was suspended for 6 games, while O'Reilly got 8 games. This is just one of several great rivalries between New York and Boston. You have the Yankees and Red Sox, you have the Knicks and the Celtics, you also have the Jets and the Patriots, among others. Their biggest current rival, I would say though, is the Hudson River rivalry with the New Jersey Devils. This was at a high point in the 90s with Stéphane Matteau's overtime goal in Game 7 of the conference final to send the Rangers to the Stanley Cup final.
Matteau behind the net, swings it in front, he scores! Matteau! Matteau! Matteau!
The rivalry, though, has renewed in recent years, with both teams now challenging for the Stanley Cup. They met in the first round of the 2023 playoffs, but the Rangers couldn't hold a 2-0 series lead. The Devils ultimately triumphed in 7. And throughout the years, fans have always had colorful chants for their rival, even celebrating with their rival's very own goal song. And as for honorable mentions, the Rangers have played the Flyers 11 times in the playoffs, including 7 times from 1989 to 97. Now for the Devils, the Rangers are their biggest historic and current rival. My honorable mention would be the Flyers. They've faced them 5 times in the playoffs. The Scott Stevens versus Eric Lindros rivalry is one of the great player rivalries in my lifetime. And for Flyers fans, they'll never forget the Stevens hit on Lindros in Game 7 of the 2000 Conference Final. Now let's talk about the Flyers. I think their biggest historic and current rival is the Pittsburgh Penguins in the Keystone State rivalry. Both teams entered the NHL in 1967. They've met 7 times in the playoffs since 1989. The Flyers have won 4 of those series, but they haven't won any Stanley Cups in that period, whereas the Penguins have 5 Stanley Cups. This really reached its peak in 2012 in a series between Crosby's Penguins and Claude Giroux's Flyers. There was a lot of contention between those 2 players and between both sides. The Flyers won that series, but as I've said before, Pittsburgh has the cups to back it up. And for my honorable mention for Philly, well, 2 of their best moments in franchise history have come against the Boston Bruins. You got the 1974 Stanley Cup Final between the Broad Street Bullies and the Big Bad Bruins, and the reverse sweep of the Bruins in the 2010 playoffs. For the Penguins, I'm actually going to start with my honorable mention. So besides Philadelphia, I would say it's the Rangers as their division rivals, and they've met in the playoffs 8 times. But their biggest historic rival and biggest current rival, I would say, is the Washington Capitals, and I would say the same thing for Washington as well. Now, this has been mostly one-sided in the playoffs, with the Penguins going 9-2 against Washington, but it's been prolonged for over 15 years recently because of the great player rivalry between Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin, 2 generational talents, the greatest greatest competitive player rivalry in my lifetime, I would say. During this era, the Penguins have defeated the Capitals in each of their Stanley Cup runs, with Sid and Evgeny Malkin coming in 2009, 2016, and 17, 2 of those series going 7 games. But then the next year, 2018, the Capitals finally got their revenge in the second round and won their first ever Stanley Cup. And as for an honorable mention for the Capitals, they've battled the Rangers 9 times in the playoffs, including 5 times in the Ovechkin era. The Rangers overall have a 5-4 series edge. Now let's get to the Carolina Hurricanes. I'm referring just to their time in North Carolina, so not the days of the Hartford Whalers. I'd say their biggest historic and current rival is the New Jersey Devils. The Canes are another top team in the Metropolitan Division right now, and they faced the Devils in last year's playoffs, the Hurricanes winning that second round series. Eric Howla for the Devils played for Carolina previously, but he hates the Hurricanes so much that he even wears a bracelet that a fan gave him that says, "Canes suck." In total, there have been 5 playoff meetings between these two teams. The Carolina Hurricanes have won 4 out of 5 series, including in 2006 during their Stanley Cup run. My honorable mention for the Canes would be the Boston Bruins. They've been a challenging opponent for the Hurricanes. They've won 3 of the 5 series against Carolina. Now for the Columbus Blue Jackets, this is somewhat tough because they've changed conferences and have only been around since 2000. I'd say their biggest historic rival is the Penguins. They're only about 3 hours apart by car. The Penguins defeated the Blue Jackets in the 2014 and 2017 playoffs, and speaking of that year, the Jackets had their best regular season with a 16-game winning streak at one point, which came just one win shy of the NHL record set by, you guessed it, the Penguins. But I'd say their current biggest rival is the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, not so much regular season drama in this one, but they met in the 2019 playoffs in the first round. The Lightning had tied an NHL record with 62 wins. They were up 3-0 against the Jackets in Game 1. The Blue Jackets come back in that game to win, and they go on to actually sweep the series in one of the greatest upsets in pro sports. Then the next year, the Lightning strike back. The first game goes into 5 overtimes with Joonas Korpisalo for Columbus, saving a record 85 shots, but his team lost. The Jackets won in Game 2, but then the Lightning, they edge out the Jackets in Games 3, 4, and 5, each by 1 goal. My honorable mention for Columbus, they've dropped the gloves the most against the Detroit Red Wings, a total of 70 times. The Red Wings also beat the Jackets in the 2008 playoffs en route to one of their Stanley Cups. And as you might know, there's a huge rivalry between the two states with the University of Michigan and the Ohio State University. Now let's get to the Atlantic Division. I'll start with the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, historically, this is a little difficult because of division realignment, but I chose the Boston Bruins. Honestly, I think that Tampa's rivals have surfaced more so in recent years, but there is some history here because legendary Bruin Phil Esposito was a co-founder of the Lightning. He was their first president and GM. They've met in the playoffs a total of 3 times. They met in the 2011 conference final, the Bruins edging out the Lightning in Game 7 1-0 en route to their first Stanley Cup in, I think, 29 years. But then the Lightning won in 2018, and then 2 years later, when they won a Stanley Cup, they defeated the Bruins then too. Their biggest current rival is the Florida Panthers in the Battle of Florida, and I'll say that the Lightning are the Panthers' biggest historic and current rival. There was definitely contention between team executives when the Panthers started up in the Miami area just 1 year after the Lightning's first season. But the on-ice animosity didn't bloom until the 2021 playoffs. The Lightning won that series in 6 games en route to their franchise's 3rd Stanley Cup, and when there weren't goals, there was lots of nastiness out there. The next year, the Panthers were on their way to the best regular season record in the NHL. They were riding a 13-game winning streak at one point, but were boat raced 8-4 by the Lightning in a scrappy game that saw Panthers coach Andrew Brunette get ejected. They faced each other in the second round of the playoffs that year, and the Lightning went on to sweep them, outscoring them 13-3, and the Panthers are still searching for their first ever Stanley Cup.
The Sunshine Series is a clean sweep of the President's Trophy winners. The Tampa Bay Lightning are going back to the Eastern Conference Final.
As for an honorable mention for these teams, for Tampa, I'll say it's the Capitals and what was a good rivalry between Steven Stamkos and Alex Ovechkin. They've also met in the playoffs 3 times. And for the Panthers, I'll say it's the New York Islanders because other than the Lightning, they're the only other team to eliminate Florida twice in the postseason. Now let's talk about the Detroit Red Wings. Their biggest historic rival is an Original Six rivalry with the Chicago Blackhawks. Don't worry, we'll get to the Avalanche later in this video, but Chicago versus Detroit. You've got the Bulls versus the Pistons, the Bears versus the Lions, and of course the Blackhawks against the Red Wings. You got to go all the way back to 1934 when these two teams met in the Stanley Cup Final. Chicago's Mush Marsh, I guess that's his name, he scored the lone goal in double overtime for the Hawks' first ever Stanley Cup, and then they would also beat Detroit in 1961 in the final in what was a great era with Stan Mikita and Bobby Hull for Chicago and Gordie Howe and Alex Delvecchio for the Red Wings. There's been a great intermingling between the two teams. You think of the Chris Chelios trade from Chicago to Detroit. Bob Probert and Stu Grimson played for both teams and fought each other 13 times. And don't forget that in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Cameron is actually wearing a Gordie Howe jersey around downtown Chicago. As for the Red Wings' biggest current rival, it's kind of tricky because the Red Wings have had a big playoff drought, but from what I've read, it's the Lightning. Probably because of Steve Yzerman, maybe the greatest Red Wing after Gordie Howe. He turned the Bolts into a championship team as general manager, so they've become the current standard for success, and now Yzerman manages his Red Wings. They also met in the 2015 and 2016 playoffs, with Detroit getting shut out in both elimination games.
Into the near corner, Callahan steals it, centers it, score! Cologne! Cologne! 1-0 Lightning with 1:43 left!
Now, my honorable mention, besides the Avalanche, I'll suggest another Original Six rivalry. The Red Wings have met the Toronto Maple Leafs in the Cup Final 7 times and 23 times in the postseason, but not in the last 30 years. Toronto has won 12 of those 23 series and 6 of the 7 Cup Finals. Now let's talk about those Maple Leafs. So their biggest historic rival is the Montreal Canadiens, and I think that the Canadiens' biggest current rival is the Maple Leafs. I'll talk about them later. It's one of the oldest rivalries in North American pro sports. You have the English-speaking province of Ontario against the French-speaking province of Quebec. They met in the first ever Stanley Cup Final in the NHL's first ever season, with Toronto winning that one. At one point, it was so competitive that the two teams combined to win every Stanley Cup from 1956 to 68 except for one, and you had this great coaches feud between Punch Imlach for the Maple Leafs, sorry if I said that wrong, and Hector Toblake for the Canadiens. Now, Toronto has a 3-2 edge over Montreal in the Stanley Cup Final, including in 1967, the last time the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup, but since then, the Canadiens have won it 10 times. And most recently, they met in 2021. The Canadiens were heavy underdogs in this series, but they battled back from down 3-1 in the series and eventually go to the Stanley Cup Final. As for the Maple Leafs' biggest current rival, I'm saying it's the Boston Bruins, another Original Six rivalry, but in more recent years, they've met 3 times in the playoffs in 2013, 18, and 19. So in 2013, the Leafs, they battle back from down 3-1 in the series, but the Bruins come back from down 4-1 in the third period of Game 7, a couple of goals with their net emptied, and then Patrice Bergeron wins it in overtime.
Taking a step, puck comes free, score! Patrice Bergeron, who tied the game and won it in overtime.
Then in 2018, Nazem Kadri for Toronto gets suspended for 3 games for a hit on Tommy Wingels. The Leafs are up 4-3 in Game 7, but the Bruins close it out with 4 unanswered goals. And the next year, it's once again Nazem Kadri, and not the last time we'll talk about him in this video. He cross-checks Jake DeBrusk. He's suspended for the rest of the series. The Bruins come back from down 3-2 in the series, and they come within 1 win of another Stanley Cup. And as for an honorable mention for Toronto, I've picked the Ottawa Senators, and we'll get to them shortly. Let's talk about the Boston Bruins. Their biggest current rival, I will say, is the Maple Leafs, but historically, it's the Montreal Canadiens, and I would say the same thing for the Canadiens. They've met 34 times in the playoffs. The Habs have won 25 of those meetings and are 7-0 against the Bruins in the Stanley Cup Final. There's been so much nastiness over the decade. I'll just highlight a few of these. So in 55, Maurice Richard bashed Hal Layco in the face, and he punched the linesman. He's suspended for the rest of the year, and the Canadiens fans riot. Then in 02, Kyle McLaren threw a huge shot on Richard Zednik in the playoffs, only for Jose Theodore to go God mode and take the series. And then in 2011, you have the Zdeno Chara hit on Max Pacioretty. Montreal police actually had to conduct a criminal investigation, although Zdeno Chara wasn't suspended. You also had that great goalie fight in recent years between Tim Thomas and Carey Price, and there's so much more I could talk about here. As for an honorable mention for both the Bruins and the Canadiens, I'd say it's the Lightning, especially in recent years for Boston, since Tampa has kind of stood in their way of another Stanley Cup. But for the Canadiens and Lightning, that rivalry, they've met 3 times in the postseason in 15 years, and now great Lightning player Martin St. Louis is the Habs head coach, and the Lightning, of course, beat the Canadiens in the 2021 Stanley Cup final before St. Louis became coach. Now let's get to the Ottawa Senators. Their biggest historic rival is also their biggest current rival, and that is the Maple Leafs in the Battle of Ontario. It sort of dates back to when the old Ottawa Senators would battle the Maple Leafs in the 1920s. But looking back at the last 30 years or so, it's been an even rivalry in the regular season. The Leafs have won 83 times, the Sens have won 78 times. But the great Ottawa Senators teams of the 2000s could never get past the Maple Leafs in the playoffs. They lost to them 4 times in a 5-year span. In the 0-2 series in Game 5, Daniel Alfredsson boarded Darcy Tucker, and then he went on to score the winning goal. The next year, Tucker goes after Chris Neil on the bench. They've had some good battles in recent years as well, including the Ottawa Senators comeback from down 5-1 in a 2021 game. And my honorable mention for Ottawa would be the Buffalo Sabres, because they were also a great team in the 2000s as well. The Sabres won 3 of their 4 playoff meetings, with Dominik Hasek and Ryan Miller shutting down all those great weapons for the Sens. And our last team in the Atlantic Division is the Buffalo Sabres. Their biggest historic rival is the Boston Bruins. The Bruins won 5 playoff meetings from 1982 to 92, including an overtime Game 7 on a goal from Brad Park in their 83 series. But then 1 decade later, the Sabres finally get revenge on an overtime goal from Brad May in what goes down as one of the most iconic calls in all of hockey by the legend Rick Jeanneret. Rest in peace.
He's May going in on goal. He shoots. He scores!
The Sabres beat the Bruins in 99 en route to a Stanley Cup final appearance, but then the Bruins pull off an upset in 2010. The next year, Milan Lucic concusses Ryan Miller in a horrible collision. As for the Sabres' biggest current rival, I've chosen the Maple Leafs in what is called the Battle of the Q, the Queen Elizabeth Way, which connects Buffalo and Toronto. There's just about 100 miles between the arenas. These games should be great going forward as the Sabres get better and more relevant, and of course you still have that great core for the Toronto Maple Leafs. You had that great feud between Dahlin and Matthews in the 2022 Heritage Classic. There's only been 1 playoff meeting between these 2 teams though. The Sabres won in the 1999 conference final, and of course the Leafs haven't been to the final since 67. My honorable mention for Buffalo, I could say the Senators, but the Sabres have actually faced the Canadiens 7 times in the playoffs, and they've physically fought the Canadiens more than anyone else except for the Bruins. They haven't faced each other in the postseason since 1998. All right, now let's go to the Central Division and our first team here, the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, I already talked about their historic rivalry with the Red Wings, so let's talk about their current rival. That is the St. Louis Blues, and I think the Blues see the Hawks as their biggest historic rival. You, of course, have that great St. Louis-Chicago rivalry in sports, especially between the Cubs and the Cardinals as well. Joel Quenneville was the coach for both teams, and he won cups with the Blackhawks. Bobby Hull, one of the greatest Blackhawks of all time, and his son, Brett Hull, one of the greatest St. Louis Blues of all time, and all 6 Sutter brothers actually played between these 2 organizations. This rivalry hit a high point in 1991 during what is known as the St. Patrick's Day Massacre. It was a battle for the President's Trophy for the best regular season record between these 2 teams. They finished 1-2 in the NHL. 12 players were ejected during this crazy series of brawls. 3 were suspended, including Blues captain Scott Stevens, and additionally Mike Peluso and Kelly Chase each got 10 games. They've met 12 times in the playoffs. The Blackhawks have won 8 times. In 93, the Blues actually sweep Chicago in a huge upset, and Blackhawks goaltender Ed Belfour actually trashes the St. Louis locker room. In more recent years, you have the 2014 series. The Blues actually led 2-0 in that series, and in Game 2, Brent Seabrook took out David Backes. He was suspended for 3 games, but the Blackhawks prevailed in 6 games. But then the Blues got revenge 2 years later in 7 games on a winning goal from former Blackhawk Troy Brouwer as they defeated the defending champions.
Nicely able to pull away. Got it to Fabry. Side to net. Save. Rebound. Score!
Now, as for my honorable mention with Chicago, I could say maybe the Predators, but what about the Kings? These 2 teams combined for 5 of the 6 Stanley Cups from 2010 to 2015. They met 2 times in that span. In the 2013 Western Conference Final, the Hawks won in 5, and then the next year as the defending champions, they were bounced by the Kings in 7 games. Now let's talk about the Blues. We already know about the historic rivalry, but as for their current rivalry, fans probably hate the Blackhawks the most still, but more so these days, there's probably some ire for the Colorado Avalanche. This really ignited in the 2021 playoffs when Once again, Nazem Kadri was suspended 8 games for a headshot to Justin Falk. The following regular season, there was a scrum after the whistle in which Jordan Binnington swung his stick at Nazem Kadri. Then in Game 3 of the 2022 playoffs, the second round, Kadri crashes the net and runs into Binnington. Binnington is injured. He misses the rest of the series. He was playing really well. And while Kadri's being interviewed after the game, Binnington throws an empty water bottle at him.
Just felt like it was a God-given opportunity.
But Kadri's not done here, except this time he actually backs it up in Game 4. He's going at it with David Perron. Perron actually jumps him, but he scores a hat trick. And in Game 6, Darren Helm, really with the exclamation point, he scores the series-winning goal with just 5.6 seconds left to send the Avalanche to the conference final.
The pass to the near side. Helm shoots, scores! Can you believe it?
And as for a Blues honorable mention, I will say the Red Wings, because they faced each other in the playoffs a bunch of times. The Blues actually lost in 91, 96, 97, 98, and 02. The Red Wings won 3 Stanley Cups in that span, and one of the most iconic goals in Red Wings history came against the Blues in 96 in Game 7, double overtime, when Steve Yzerman collects a Gretzky turnover and scores an amazing goal. Now we get to the Nashville Predators. I want to thank Stupid Seal for weighing in with his thoughts on this. Historically, their biggest rival since the beginning has probably been the Chicago Blackhawks. This rivalry peaked in the 2010s when they met in the playoffs 3 times in 2010, 15, and 17. In 2010, in Game 5, Patrick Kane scores shorthanded with 14 seconds left to tie the game. Chicago wins in overtime, they win the series, and they win the Stanley Cup, their first one in 39 years. Then in a 2015 series, the Hawks win one of the games in double overtime. They win one other one in triple overtime en route to another Stanley Cup. But in 2017, the Predators were the lowest seeded team in the West. The Blackhawks were the top seed, but Nashville actually swept them, outscoring them 13-3. However, there's still some ire there because the Predators have yet to win a Stanley Cup, and the Hawks have the hardware to really back it up. As for their biggest current rival, I will say the Dallas Stars. They met in the 2019 playoffs. The Stars won in overtime of Game 6, and that kind of closed the Predators' Stanley Cup contention window. Then the next year they met at the 2020 Winter Classic. Corey Perry elbowed Ryan Ellis and was suspended for 5 games. And then in 2021, the Predators edged out the Stars for that final playoff spot. But on the plus side, both organizations have actually been charitable toward one another when natural disasters have hit their respective cities. And as for an honorable mention for the Preds, they had great playoff battles in the 2010s against the Anaheim Ducks, but they have a more extensive history with the Red Wings having played in the same division at one point. Now let's get to the Stars. We're talking about their time as the Dallas Stars, so not the Minnesota North Stars. Their biggest historic rival, I've actually determined it's the Avalanche. They met 5 times in the playoffs, including during real heights for both franchises, with of course Joe Sakic, Peter Forsberg, Patrick Waugh for Colorado, and Mike Modano, Ed Belfour, and Sergei Zubov for the Stars. They met in the 1999 conference final. The Stars battled back from down 3-2 in the series and won their lone Stanley Cup. The same thing happened in 2000 in games 5, 6, and 7. These are all 1-goal games as the Stars triumph, but they lose in the final that year. And then they meet again in 2020 in a great 7-game series decided in overtime on a Joel Kiviranta goal. And the rivalry right now is great too because both teams are at the top of the division. They have a Stanley Cup window that's open right now, and so we'll see if one of them can actually win it in 2024. The Stars' biggest current rival, especially from what I gathered on Reddit, there's a lot of hate for the St. Louis Blues. The Blues defeated the Stars in 2016 in 7 games, and then they met 3 years later in the playoffs. In Game 3, Pat Maroon scored the game winner with 1 minute and 38 seconds left, and then Maroon did it again in Game 7, double overtime, as the Blues won their first and lone Stanley Cup to this day.
This is Thomas. Thomas shoots. Gets behind it. It's not good by Maroon.
And as for my honorable mention, I've chosen the Edmonton Oilers. They met 5 times in the playoffs in the 90s and the 2000s. We never forget the Patrick Stefan blunder. And they could theoretically battle each other in the conference final one of these years. Now let's talk about the Colorado Avalanche. This is during their time in Denver, not as the Quebec Nordiques. Their biggest historic rival is the Detroit Red Wings. They met 5 times in the playoffs from 96 to 02, and they combined for 5 of the 7 Stanley Cups in that era. They also met in 2008, but it really dates back to 1996 in the conference final. The Red Wings had gone 40 years without a Stanley Cup. They are favorites in this series. In Game 3, Claude Lemieux punches Slava Kozlov after his hit on Adam Foote, and Lemieux is suspended for Game 4. And then in Game 6, Lemieux's infamous hit on Chris Draper. It's so gruesome that I could probably get demonetized just for talking about it. The Avalanche win the Stanley Cup their first season in Denver. But then the next year, we've got Fight Night at the Joe. It's the last regular season meeting between these two teams. Peter Forsberg and Igor Larionov start fighting, and Detroit's Darren McCarty uses this as an opportunity to punch Lemieux, and Lemieux turtles defenselessly. We have even more brawls, including a goalie fight between Patrick Waugh and Mike Vernon, and it's not the last one in this rivalry. The Red Wings actually clawed back from down 2 goals and won that game in overtime. They met again in the 97 conference final. Detroit wins that series, they get revenge, and they win the Stanley Cup. Then in the next regular season, Lemieux and McCarty, they actually duke it out mutually.
There they are already talking. Lemieux and McCarty, who've had a good knockdown, drag out, and there they go, right on the whistle.
Oh, baby.
They were talking to one another.
And later that year, Patrick Waugh fights another Red Wings goalie, and this one was Chris Osgood. We almost had a third goaltender fight in 2002 between Waugh and Dominik Hasek. The Wings won that playoff series in 7 games, including emphatically 7-0 in Game 7. That's the last real high point in this rivalry. Now, as for the Avs' biggest current rival right now, there are arguments to be made, but I've chosen the Minnesota Wild, or as they call them, the Minnesota Mild, and I'll say the same thing for Minnesota regarding the Avs. Now, during the height of this rivalry, neither team was particularly dominant, but there were some very eventful moments. The Wild won their first ever playoff series against them in 2003, Andrew Brunette scoring that goal in Game 7 in overtime, the last goal that Patrick Waugh would surrender in his career. The Avs won in 2008, in which 5 of the 6 games in that series were 1-goal contests. And then in 2014, first of all, you had the Matt Cook hit on Tyson Barrie. He's suspended for 7 games. And later in those playoffs, it's Nino Niederreiter scoring the series winner in overtime of Game 7. And my honorable mention will be the Dallas Stars, as I discussed a little bit earlier. Now, as for the Wild, the Avalanche are their biggest current rival, but their biggest historic rival is the Chicago Blackhawks. I kind of cheated on this one, but you'll see why. It's not a very deep rivalry, but it's one where the Wild fans want their moment for redemption, because in 2013, 14, and 15, the Hawks swept Minnesota in the playoffs and they won 2 Stanley Cups in those runs. In 2014, Patrick Kane scores the overtime winner in Game 6. But really, for older Minnesota hockey fans, there was a great rivalry between the Blackhawks and the old Minnesota North Stars. They battled in the playoffs in 82, 83, 84, a nail-biter of a series in 85, and then a 7-game series in 1990, and a huge upset over the Blackhawks in 1991. And this is just one of several rivalries between the Twin Cities and Chicago. Of course, you have Vikings versus Bears for the NFL, and you have Twins and White Sox in MLB. My honorable mention for the Wild would be the Dallas Stars, as they are the original North Stars and beat Minnesota in the 2016 and 2023 playoffs. And as we've seen, the Wild fans have come to really hate former player Ryan Suter, especially for his cross-check on Kirill Kaprizov. Our next team is the Winnipeg Jets, and for this, I'll actually include the original Jets in this discussion. So their biggest historic rival is actually the Edmonton Oilers, because this dates all the way back to 1972 in the World Hockey Association. The Jets beat the Oilers twice in the playoffs, including in the league's final season to win the Avco Cup, but the script really flipped when both teams entered the NHL. The Oilers beat the Jets 5 times in the playoffs from 1983 to 88 and won 4 of their Stanley Cups. They only lost once to Winnipeg. In that entire time, only lost 1 game. And in 1990, without Wayne Gretzky in Edmonton, the Jets actually have a 3-1 series lead against the Oilers, and they won twice in overtime, and they have a 3-1 series lead in Game 5, but the Oilers battled back, they won the series, and they won their 5th Stanley Cup. Their most recent postseason battle came in 2021 when Winnipeg shockingly swept Edmonton. Now for the Jets' biggest current rival, it's close between these two teams, but instead of Minnesota, I've actually chosen the Predators, because they've sort of mirrored each other in the standings quite a bit, including in 2018 when the Predators won the President's Trophy and the Jets were just 3 points behind them. They met in the second round of the playoffs that year in what was a back and forth series. The Jets ultimately prevailed in 7 games, and there's been kind of an interesting trade-off between these two markets, right? A lot of contrast. You have the small but traditional hockey market in Winnipeg versus a southern market. Both teams have all sorts of clever fan chants, especially for taunting the opponent's goaltender, and both teams are still seeking their first ever Stanley Cup. And as for my honorable mention for Winnipeg, now the team they faced the most in the playoffs as the current version of the Winnipeg Jets is actually the Vegas Golden Knights. They met in the 2018 conference final and in the 2023 first round. The Jets actually won Game 1 both times, but were swept the rest of the way. And as for our last team in the Central Division, I have the Arizona Coyotes. A lot of folks would say it's the Winnipeg Jets, but they don't have any playoff history between the two teams, so their biggest historic rival is actually the Avalanche. They've matched up very well against each other. Both teams have won 61 51 times against each other as I make this in October of 2023. The Avs, however, have won the 2 playoff meetings coming in 2000 and 2020. As far as the Coyotes' biggest current rival, it's tough to say, but I'll go with the Predators. They've met in the playoffs 2 times, once in 2012 with the Coyotes winning, and also in 2020. Now that was a tight defensive series. Darcy Kemper for Arizona was the difference maker, going full God mode. In Game 4, Philip Forsberg scores with his net emptied in the final minute, but Brad Richardson for the Yotes wins it in overtime to take the best-of-5 series.
Curling to the front, stop, rebound, they score! They score! Brad Richardson, series is over!
Also, the Predators were the final opponent for the Coyotes in their last home game at Gila River Arena in 2022. Arizona actually erased a 4-goal deficit to win that game. And as for an honorable mention, the Kings are the most hated among Coyotes fans. I would probably say more often than not, it's LA. They eliminated the Coyotes in the 2012 conference final, the furthest that Arizona has ever been in the playoffs while playing in Arizona. And it was really the last time they truly qualified for the playoffs as a top 8 team in their conference. But really, the Kings fans don't care about the Yotes all that much. And lastly, we have the Pacific Division, so we'll start with the Vancouver Canucks. Their biggest historic rival is the Calgary Flames. First of all, the Canucks have physically fought the Flames and the LA Kings the most. They've been longtime division rivals, and they've met 7 times in the playoffs. Several times, the winner of this series goes to the Stanley Cup Final. So for example, the Canucks won in 1982 en route to the Stanley Cup Final. Then in 89, the Flames won in Game 7 in overtime on a goal from Joel Otto, and they won their lone Stanley Cup. Then in 94, the Canucks returned the favor in double overtime in Game 7 on a goal from Pavel Bure.
Bure going in! He scores! Pavel Bure has won it for the Vancouver Canucks!
The Canucks lost in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. Then in 04, the Flames won in overtime Game 7 on a goal from Martin Jelena, but they lost in Game 7 of the Cup Final. And then in the 2014 regular season, the Flames started their 4th line and incited a line brawl against the Canucks. Long story short, 8 players were ejected, and Canucks coach John Tortorella was suspended for 15 days for trying to enter the Flames locker room during intermission to confront coach Bob Hartley. Now for the Canucks' biggest current rival, I traversed Reddit quite a bit, and since the Canucks don't really have an intense rivalry with anybody right now, and we're waiting for that to really blossom and take off against Seattle, really, fans still hate the Boston Bruins. This dates back to 2011 in the Stanley Cup Final. The Canucks were still trying to win their first Stanley Cup. They've been in the NHL since 1970. They won the first 2 games of the series, but the Bruins came back, ultimately forcing Game 7, and it was a 4-0 loss for the Vancouver Canucks in their own barn, and the city rioted. During the series, Alex Burrows bit Patrice Bergeron's finger in a scrum and received only a double minor penalty for roughing, and then Maxime Laperriere taunted Patrice Bergeron afterwards, and later on, a couple seasons later, Brad Marchand would taunt fans by pretending to raise the Stanley Cup like he did in their building in 2011. And as for my honorable mention, what about those great playoff battles between the Canucks and the Blackhawks? This started in 2009. There was a line brawl in the regular season. They meet in the playoffs. The Blackhawks win that series, and then they win again in 2010. But the Canucks slay the Dragon in 2011, a series in which Raffi Torres took out Brent Seabrook, causing him to miss 2 games. Now let's talk about the Calgary Flames and the Edmonton Oilers. For both historic and current rivalries, it's all about the Battle of Alberta. In the McDavid and Draisaitl era, and before that in the Gretzky era for Edmonton, we're talking about maybe the best rivalry in the NHL. Competitive, nasty as well. First of all, both teams are seeking their first Stanley Cup in over 30 years and Canada's first Stanley Cup since 1993. But before now, both teams represented the old Western Conference, the Campbell Conference, 8 straight years in the finals in the 1980s and early 90s. They met each other in the postseason in 83, 84, 86, 88, and 91. The Flames won just in 86 when Steve Smith scored on his own goal in Game 7, and then another epic finish in 1991. It was Esa Tikkanen for the Oilers winning it in overtime for the upset. Flash forward to 2020 when there were hits and a fight between Zach Kassian and Matthew Tkachuk. The next game, there's a line brawl where Mike Smith fights Cam Talbot, another great goalie fight, and then they meet in the playoffs in 2022. They've got another brawl there, and then Connor McDavid ends that series in Game 5 in overtime.
And McDavid scores! Game winner! Series winner for Connor McDavid!
And as for my honorable mention for these two teams, for the Flames, I'd say it's the Canucks, although the rivalry with the Anaheim Ducks has kind of been a unique one. And for the Oilers, they have a lot. We could talk about the Stars, we could talk about the Jets, but it's going to be the next team that I talk about here, and that's the Los Angeles Kings. Now, this is a bit of a twisted take, but hear me out. I think the Kings' biggest historic and current rival is actually the Oilers. Shortly after the Oilers entered the NHL in '79, the Kings moved to the Smythe Division to face the Oilers more frequently. You had those great battles between Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier and the Oilers, between Marcel Dion and the Triple Crown line for Los Angeles. In 1980, Gretzky's rookie season, he and Marcel Dion had finished with a league-high 137 points, but the Art Ross Trophy went to Dion because he had more goals. They met 7 times in the playoffs from 1982 to 92, but the most iconic moment from that came in Game 3 of '82 in what is known as the Miracle on Manchester. The Kings erased a 5-goal deficit. They tied it up with just 5 seconds left and won that game in overtime and pulled off the upset in the postseason.
On the draw, shot by Evans, he scores! Oh! Darryl Evans wins the game for the Kings!
But the Oilers were the ones winning Stanley Cups during that decade. In 1988, Wayne Gretzky is traded to the Kings in what might be the biggest trade ever in pro sports. That season with LA, he wins the Hart Trophy as the MVP and defeats his old team in 7 games in the postseason. But the next year, the Oilers beat the Kings en route to their 5th Stanley Cup. And right now, they've met the past 2 times in the playoffs. The Oilers have won both times, but the Kings are hungry for revenge with some great talent on their roster. In 2022, it went 7 games with a tight 2-0 Game 7 victory for the Oilers, and then they triumphed the next year in 6. Now, as for my honorable mention for the Kings, take your pick between the 2 other California teams, and you could also maybe argue the Golden Knights, but I'm going to stick with this next team that I'm talking about, and that's the Anaheim Ducks. Their biggest historic rival is also their biggest current rival, and I'd say it's the LA Kings, despite some great playoff series with other teams. This is the freeway face-off in Southern California. These arenas are only about 30 miles apart from each other, and you also have that great interleague rivalry between the Dodgers and Angels for baseball. Now, these teams have only met 1 time in the postseason in 2014. After reverse sweeping the Sharks, the Kings defeated the Ducks in 7 games en route to their 2nd Stanley Cup.
Kyle Clifford finished off. What a hit by Getzlaf. Now King with a shot. Stopped by Gibson. They score on the rebound. It's Mike Richards.
In what was a great decade for California hockey, you had 3 great teams battling each other out. But for Anaheim and LA, you had Getzlaf and Perry and John Gibson for Anaheim in tight defensive contests against Andrei Kopitar and Dirty Dustin Brown and Drew Doughty and Jonathan Quick and the Kings. The Ducks have been pretty bad recently, but once they get good, I believe the Kings will be a fierce rival of theirs. And plus, the Ducks have 1 cup, the Kings have 2, so the Ducks still have some ground to make up there. And for an honorable mention for the Ducks, I actually chose the Red Wings, their most familiar playoff opponent. They met in the playoffs 5 times, whereas, for example, they've only met the Sharks twice, and the Ducks only won 2 of those 5 series, but they did make it count against the Red Wings in 2007 in the conference final en route to their lone Stanley Cup. Now let's talk about my team, that's the San Jose Sharks. Their biggest historic rival is the LA Kings. Now, it really took about 20 years for this rivalry to truly ignite, but it was a top rivalry in its day. You'd have those Sharks suck chants in LA, and you'd have all the beat LA chants in the Bay Area. There's been a lot of crossover between coaching and management for these 2 teams. General manager Dean Lombardi and coach Daryl Sutter had been fired from San Jose. They went on to LA and they won 2 Stanley Cups. Former Sharks coach Todd McClellan is now the LA head coach. Rob Blake was a captain for the Sharks, and now he's a general manager for the Kings. And even Sharks broadcaster Randy Hahn at one point worked for the Kings before coming to San Jose. They've battled in the playoffs 4 times, 2011, 13, 14, and 16. The Sharks won in 11 and 16. In 2011, in Game 3, they were actually down by 4 goals, but they came back on an overtime goal from Devin Setoguchi for the 2nd largest deficit ever erased in a playoff game, and then Joe Thornton won the series in overtime of Game 6.
Brings it back out. Far side. Thornton. They score! Joe Thornton and the Sharks win the series in overtime!
The Kings won in 2013 and 2014, both times in 7 games, but very different series. In 2013, they outscored San Jose 14-10, so again, a very tight defensive series. Jonathan Quick, a .951 save percentage, and then the next year, we all know about this one. The Kings were just dead to rights. I even saw them lose 7-2 in San Jose in Game 2, but they come back from the grave, they reverse sweep the Sharks, and they never looked back to get that 2nd Stanley Cup. The Sharks' biggest rival right now is the Vegas Golden Knights. It's not much of a rivalry for the Knights right now, but they still hate each other. The Sharks are the Knights' biggest historic rival for now, I'll say that too. This dates back to 2017 when the Knights in their first season battled the Sharks in the Pacific Division. Vegas wins that division and they beat the Sharks in the second round of the playoffs. They shut them out in the first and the last games of that series. The next year, it's a great 7-game series. The Knights are up 3-1. They're steamrolling San Jose in games 3 and 4. They had a 3-0 lead in game 7. And then, of course, they take a major penalty. The Sharks score 4 times, and then the Knights even things up at the last minute, and then Barclay Goodrow wins it for the Sharks in overtime. And later on, you had that great feud between Evander Kane and Ryan Reeves, Peter DeBoer getting fired from San Jose and ultimately going to Vegas. And then my honorable mention for San Jose, they've actually met the Blues in the playoffs the most, 6 times. San Jose upset the President's Trophy winning Blues in 2000, and then they beat St. Louis again in 2016 in the conference final. The Blues, though, returned the favor in 2019 to win their first ever Stanley Cup. Sharks fans hate Chris Pronger, Blues fans hate Joe Thornton. And lastly, we have the 2 newest teams in the NHL, so we'll start with the Golden Knights. So historically, I said it was the Sharks. As for current, I'm going to go with our guy Dean here. It's a current division rival, and that's the Edmonton Oilers, the team that Evander Kane currently plays for. The Knights have perennially dominated this division, but they've actually struggled against Edmonton quite a bit. They're just 8, 9, and 2 against them, but they battled in the playoffs this past year, and as we know, the Knights won. Throughout the series, the Oilers had been laying some hard hits on Alex Pietrangelo, and then in Game 4, he slashes Leon Draisaitl deliberately on the wrist. Connor McDavid drops the gloves against him, and then seconds later, Darnell Nurse for Edmonton jumps Nick Hague. They had been getting under each other's skin for that series, but because Nurse instigated this fight in the final 5 minutes of the game, he actually got an automatic 1-game suspension. Then in Game 5, Keegan Colasar takes a 5-minute major penalty, but the Knights, they only give up 1 goal during what was statistically the greatest power play in NHL history. I think that was a huge win, helping them secure this series. And lastly, in Game 6, they erased a 2-1 deficit to win that one and ultimately win the Stanley Cup. And as for an honorable mention for Vegas, I'll say the Dallas Stars. Now, Peter DeBoer had coached the Golden Knights when they faced the Stars in 2020. The Stars won that series, and then he was behind the bench for the Stars when they faced the Golden Knights in 2023. So he's actually 0 for 2 in the conference final against these two teams. Not to mention Joe Pavelski, who drew the 5-minute major in 2019 for the Sharks, was playing against the Golden Knights as well. And our last team is the Seattle Kraken. Of course, they're just in their 3rd year, so I'm gonna bundle the historical and current rival together. And after some deliberation, I've determined it's actually the Colorado Avalanche. They met in the 2023 playoffs with the Kraken winning in 7 games in what was a tight defensive series. There's been lots of player crossover between these teams. I think of Philip Grubauer, Andrei Burakovsky, Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, and also Jonas Donskoy. In the regular season, the matchups have been mostly very close except for the first one. The Kraken's record is actually 4-3 against Colorado as of October of 2023, and there's been a lot of intermingling between the two cities. A lot of Denver natives will move to Seattle and vice versa, and there's still some ire between Denver Broncos fans after their team got their doors blown off by the Seahawks in the Super Bowl a decade ago. My bartender would certainly attest to that. My honorable mention, I actually went with the Golden Knights because they won the Stanley Cup after 6 years as a franchise, so it's all about, hey, can the Kraken actually win it sooner than that? There's sort of that comparison in the Kraken's success versus that of the Golden Knights, and they really have given the Kraken a lot of fits so far in their time as a young franchise. All right, guys, so what is your favorite moment from your favorite team's biggest rivalry? Comment below, shout out other ideas you have for this sort of content, and stick around. We're going to have all sorts of content throughout the NHL season. In the meantime, you can keep up with us on Discord. We're also on Rumble and other social platforms. Just see the video description down below, and we'll have some more fun throughout this NHL season. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was a long one, but I had a blast working on this, and I'll talk to you again real soon.